My brother looked at the house our parents built, the home where every floorboard held a memory, and all he saw was a lottery ticket. He handed me a legal notice during the worst snowstorm of the year. His eyes as cold as the ice forming on the windowpane. The house is bleeding money. Elara, he said, his voice flat, it's time to let it go. He had no idea the house wasn't the only thing bleeding, or that our mother's will had one final secret lesson waiting for him. The old cedar house groaned under the weight of the snow. It was a sound I knew well, a deep, woody sigh that was as familiar to me as my own breathing. Outside, the world had vanished into a swirling vortex of white. The wind howled around the eaves, rattling the storm windows my father had installed himself 20 years ago. It was the kind of tempête de neige that shuts down the whole town of Claremont. The kind that makes you grateful for a full pantry and a stack of dry firewood. Usually, I loved these storms. They were an excuse to slow down, to curl up on the Chesterfield with a book, the scent of pine from the woodstove filling the air. But tonight, the house's familiar sounds felt less like a comforting embrace and more like the moans of a patient in pain. The reason for its pain was sitting on the kitchen table, right next to the half-empty mug of tea I couldn't bring myself to finish. It was an estimate from Fondations Tremblay and Fils, and the number at the bottom seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. $32,450. $32,000. To fix a crack in the foundation that was, according to Monsieur Tremblay, a real problem. Mademoiselle, a ticking time bomb. I ran a hand over the worn oak of the table, my fingers tracing the faint knife marks where Dad used to chop vegetables for his famous tourtière. After Mom and Dad's accident 3 years ago, every surface in this house had become a memorial. The worn spot on the armchair where Mom read her novels. The faint scent of Dad's pipe tobacco that still clung to the curtains in his study. This house wasn't just wood and nails, it was the last tangible piece of them I had left. And now, it was literally breaking apart. That's when I saw the headlights cutting through the blizzard. A salt-stained Toyota, struggling up the unplowed driveway. My stomach tightened. It was Liam, my little brother. He blew in with a flurry of snow and a gust of frigid air. Looking like a rock star on the run. Faded band t-shirt under a thin leather jacket. Designer scarf wrapped around his neck. His dark hair artfully messy. He shook the snow from his shoulders. His movements quick and impatient. Filling the quiet kitchen with a restless energy that always felt too big for the space. "Can you believe this weather?" he said, kicking off his boots without bothering to use the mat. "The 40 is a total disaster. Took me 3 hours to get here from Montreal. You shouldn't have driven in this." "Liam," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. He ignored me, his eyes scanning the kitchen before landing on the estimate on the table. He picked it up, letting out a low whistle. 32 grand? Tabarnuche. That's insane. He dropped the paper, his expression shifting from surprise to something harder. Something I'd been seeing more and more often lately. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Elara, it's a sign. It's a crack in the foundation. Liam, it's not a message from the universe." I got up to pour him a coffee. The familiar ritual, a small defense against the conversation I knew was coming. "It's a money pit," he said, following me to the counter. "A beautiful, charming, ridiculously expensive money pit. We can't afford this. You can't afford this." The "you" was deliberate. I was the one who'd stayed in Claremont. The one working double shifts as a nurse at the local clinic to pay the mortgage. The hydro bills that skyrocketed every winter. The property taxes that kept climbing. Liam was the one who'd taken his small part of the inheritance and moved to the city to make it, as a musician. Living in a loft with 2 roommates and a mountain of debt. I handed him the mug. Our hands brushed, and his felt cold. "I'm managing." The words tasted like a lie. Even to me. "No, you're not," he said, his voice softening into that charming, persuasive tone he used when he wanted something. The one that used to work on Mom and Dad every single time. "You're just surviving. Stuck here, rattling around in this huge, empty house. Think about what we could do with the money from this place. It's prime real estate now. With all the city folk moving in, we could both be free." I looked out the window. The snow was coming down so hard I couldn't even see the giant maple tree Dad had planted when I was born. Free from what? This is our home. It was our home, he corrected gently. Now it's an asset, a burden. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope, placing it on the counter between us. It wasn't a friendly letter. The law firm's name was printed in the corner. I spoke to someone. Elara, a lawyer. He says this is the cleanest way to get the process started. The hum of the refrigerator suddenly sounded deafening. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall felt like a countdown. I stared at the envelope, then at my brother's face. The charming musician was gone. In his place was a stranger. A businessman closing a deal. You got a lawyer? My voice was barely a whisper. It's for the best, he said, not meeting my eyes. We need to sell the house. Elara, and I'm not asking. That white envelope sat on the counter. A stark, clean rectangle in a kitchen that was anything but. It felt like a declaration of war. For a long moment, the only sounds were the grandfather clock in the hall, ticking away seconds of a life that was suddenly unrecognizable, and the wind screaming outside, as if in protest. I didn't reach for the letter. I didn't need to. Its presence was enough. I wrapped my hands around my cooling mug of tea, the ceramic a poor shield against the chill that had settled deep in my bones. You went to a lawyer before you even spoke to me? I asked. My voice was calm, almost detached. It was the same tone I used at the clinic to read a difficult diagnosis from a chart. A professional wall built to contain the chaos. Liam had the decency to look away, turning his gaze to the window where snow was plastering itself against the glass. I knew what you'd say. Elara, I knew you'd get emotional. You always do, when it comes to this place. Emotional? The word was a lit match in the quiet room. This is where Mom brought us home from the hospital. This is where Dad taught us how to skate on the frozen creek out back. It's where his ashes are scattered, under the big maple. Of course I'm emotional. Liam, are you not? Being emotional doesn't pay the bills. He shot back, his voice raw. His phone buzzed on the counter. A harsh, insistent vibration. He glanced down, his jaw tightening at whatever name he saw on the screen, and silenced it with a jab of his thumb. It doesn't fix a $30,000 crack in the foundation. It doesn't pay my student loans or the hydro bill that's probably going to be $1,000 after this storm. He started pacing, a caged animal in the small space. I'm drowning. Elara, do you get that? While you're here, playing matriarch in our family museum, I'm out there actually trying to build a life. A real life. Dad promised he'd help me get the studio set up. He promised. His voice broke on that last word. And for a second, the anger in my chest faltered. I saw the lost little boy who used to follow me everywhere. The teenager who poured his whole soul into his guitar. But the moment passed, replaced by the cold reality of the lawyer's letter on my counter. Dad would never have wanted this, I said, my voice hardening. He would never want you to try and force me out of our home. He would want me to survive. Liam's shout was so sudden, so full of ragged fury, that it seemed to shake the very dishes in the cupboards. He wouldn't want his son to be a failure. This house is the only lifeline I have left. Before I could answer, there was a loud stamping of boots on the porch, followed by a firm knock. We both froze. Through the frosted glass of the back door, I could see a familiar, stout figure. Mon Dieu, Aunt Genevieve. I opened the door, and she bustled in, a casserole dish wrapped in a tea towel clutched in her mittens and a dusting of snow on her salt and pepper hair. Quelle tempête, she declared, her cheeks rosy from the cold. I saw your brother's car. Elara, ma chérie, and I thought, these children will need a proper dinner. She set the dish on the counter, and the rich, savory scent of her famous tourtière filled the kitchen. It was the smell of every Christmas, every family gathering, every moment of comfort in my life. Tonight, it felt like an anesthetic. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, darted from the legal envelope on the counter to Liam's tense shoulders. Then to my face. She let out a heavy sigh and pulled me into a hug that smelled of cinnamon and damp wool. Oh, mes petites, still fighting, even after all this time. Over my shoulder, I could feel her patting my back, but I could also see her gaze resting on Liam. It was a look I couldn't quite decipher, part sympathy, Part something else. Something calculating. He wants to sell the house. Auntie, I said, my voice muffled in her coat. She pulled back, holding me at arm's length. She looked at Liam, her expression one of gentle chiding. Liam, this house is your sister's heart. And it's a chain around my neck. He muttered, not looking at her. Genevieve clicked her tongue. Come, she said, taking charge as always. We will eat. A hot meal settles the soul. She started pulling plates from the cupboards. Her movements efficient and familiar. For the next hour, she was a whirlwind of maternal energy. Slicing the meat pie, warming up the leftover peas I'd made last night, and steering the conversation into safe, shallow waters. Gossip about the neighbors. Complaints about the snow removal. Stories about her cat. Liam and I sat in sullen silence. The unspoken tension of fourth person at the table. His phone buzzed again. Face down this time. He ignored it. A minute later, it buzzed again. And again. Finally, he snatched it up. I have to take this, he grumbled, stalking into the living room. Aunt Genevieve watched him go. A sad shake of her head. He has his father's dreams. Non, she said to me. Her voice low. Big dreams. They are a heavy burden for a young man to carry alone. She reached across the table and patted my hand. You have your mother's strength. Elara, you are the anchor. But sometimes, an anchor holds a ship in the harbor when it needs to be at sea. Her words were meant to be comforting. I think, a wise, neutral observation, but something about them felt wrong. Like a key turning in the wrong lock. It felt like she was justifying him. Framing his betrayal as ambition and my stability as a cage. Liam came back a few minutes later. His face pale. The swagger was gone, replaced by a thin, brittle exhaustion. He avoided my eyes, focusing on a spot on the wall behind me. That was the bank, he said, his voice hollow. My final notice. He finally looked at me. And in his eyes, I saw a terrifying mix of desperation and defiance. I'm not asking. Elara, this is happening. After Liam left, claiming he needed to get back to the city before the roads were completely impassable. Aunt Genevieve helped me with the dishes. Be patient with him, ma petite, she said, her hands moving in the warm, soapy water. His grief is different from yours. It makes him reckless. She hugged me again at the door. A long, firm embrace. You are a good woman. Elara Dubois, a good daughter. You do what you think is right. She held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary. And I saw that same unreadable expression in her eyes. It was a look of pity. But it was threaded with something else. Something that looked unnervingly like triumph. I watched her car reverse down the driveway. Its red taillights swallowed by the swirling snow. The tourtière sat on the counter. Half eaten. The house was quiet again. Save for the wind and the ticking clock. Her visit should have been a comfort. A reminder of family and support. Instead, a seed of suspicion had been planted. A cold, hard knot in my stomach that had nothing to do with Liam's threats. And everything to do with the woman who had just called me a good daughter. The morning after the storm was unnervingly beautiful. The world had been scrubbed clean and buried under a thick, glittering blanket of white. An almost sacred silence had fallen over Claremont, broken only by the distant scrape of a snowplow on the main road and the cheerful chirp of chickadees at the feeder outside the kitchen window. The silence felt like a judgment. The sun, when it finally broke through the clouds, was a cold, brilliant white, casting long blue shadows across the snowdrifts that had swallowed our front porch. I held the lawyer's letter in my hand. In the harsh morning light, the crisp legal jargon seemed even more alien and brutal. Partition of property, fiduciary duty, legal recourse. These were not words that belonged in my parents' house. My first call was to a name I'd found in Mom's old address book. Under, B, for besoin, need. Benoit, Arthur, avocat. The voice that answered was exactly the opposite of what I imagined Liam's slick city lawyer would sound like. It was slow, gravelly, and carried the unmistakable cadence of a man who had lived his entire life within the same 50-kilometer radius. Elara Dubois, I said, my voice sounding thin in the quiet kitchen. My parents were Jean-Pierre and Isabelle Dubois. You helped them with their will. Ah, yes, Isabelle, he said, and for a moment, the gravel in his voice softened. A fine woman. Strong. How can I help you? Mademoiselle Dubois? I explained the situation in clipped, nursing chart sentences. The house. The foundation. My brother. The letter. I didn't add the emotion. The betrayal. The crushing weight of it all. I just gave him the facts. He listened without interruption, a skill I knew was rare. I see, he said, after a long pause. Your brother is forcing a partition sale. It is his right, I am afraid, as a co-owner. But the will, I started, my hope beginning to fray. Doesn't it say anything? Anything that could stop this? Your parents' will was very straightforward, Mr. Benoit said gently. They left the property to their 2 children. In equal shares. They assumed, as most parents do, that their children would figure it out. Bring me the letter your brother gave you. And a copy of the deed. We will see what there is to see. He didn't offer comfort or false promises. But in his calm, methodical tone, I found a small, solid piece of ground to stand on. After the call, a grim determination settled over me. If there was anything, a letter of intent, an addendum, a forgotten note scribbled on a napkin, that could prove Mom and Dad wanted me to keep this house, I would find it. The attic was the heart of the house's memory. Pulling down the folding stairs felt like opening a tomb. The air that drifted down was thick with the scent of cedar, old paper, and mothballs, the perfume of the past. I hadn't been up here since we'd sorted through their things 3 years ago. A task that had felt like packing away my own childhood in neatly labeled boxes. A single beam of sunlight cut through the dusty gloom from a small circular window, illuminating a galaxy of swirling dust motes. All around me were the ghosts of our lives. Stacks of Liam's old drawings, full of superheroes and fantastical creatures. My old nursing school textbooks. A row of my mother's summer hats, covered in a thin sheet of plastic. My father's old hockey gear from his time with the Claremont Canadiens, the leather stiff and cracked with age. I started with the big metal filing cabinet in the corner. My fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the rusted latch. Inside were decades of meticulously organized files. Appliance warranties from the 1980s. Tax returns. Car maintenance records. Nothing. Next, I moved to a large wooden trunk. Maman's hope chest. Inside, nestled in yellowed tissue paper, was her wedding dress. A simple lace affair that still held the faint scent of her perfume. Beneath it were bundles of letters, tied with faded blue ribbon. They were from Dad, written when he was working up north on a hydro project for a year. I untied one bundle, my hands trembling slightly. The paper was brittle, the ink faded. My dearest Isabel, one began. The nights are cold up here, but I just think of the home we'll build. A place with strong walls and deep roots. For our children. A lump formed in my throat. I set the letters aside, my resolve hardening. This was what I was fighting for. I spent hours sifting through the past. I found a box of old photographs. The glossy square prints from a time before phones. There was Liam and me, maybe 5 and 8, with huge, gapped-tooth grins, holding up a string of sunfish we'd caught in the creek. There was another of Mom and Dad on their wedding day, looking impossibly young and full of a kind of hope I couldn't quite fathom right now. But as I dug deeper, the sweet nostalgia began to curdle. I found my old report cards, all straight A's and glowing comments. Then I found Liam's, full of C's and D's, with notes from teachers about his lack of focus, his artistic temperament. Tucked into one of them was a note from Mom to Dad. Jean-Pierre, I am worried about our Liam. He dreams so big, but he does not see the work that must go with it. He thinks the world owes him a stage. The words were a small, sharp shock, a premonition I'd been too young to see. The distance between us hadn't started with our parents' death. It had been there all along. A quiet, hairline fracture in our family's foundation that was only now threatening to bring the whole structure down. By late afternoon, the sunlight from the small window had turned a syrupy gold, and I was covered in a fine layer of dust and discouragement. I'd found nothing. No legal document, no hidden clause, no silver bullet, just memories, just evidence of a life that was gone forever. Defeated, I sank down onto an old chest, my breath fogging in the cold air. My head was pounding, my hands were freezing. The weight of my failure pressed down on me, as heavy as the snow on the roof. My eyes landed on my father's old work coat. hanging from a nail on a rafter. It was a faded blue canvas, stained with paint and motor oil. On impulse, I reached into one of the deep pockets. My fingers closed around something small and hard. It wasn't a letter or a legal document. It was a half-finished wood carving. A small, intricately detailed bird, a chickadee, its head cocked as if listening. I remembered him working on it, sitting on the back porch one summer evening, the shavings piling up around his worn boots. He never finished it. I closed my hand around the small wooden bird, its unfinished edges digging into my palm. A wave of anger, cold and pure, washed away the exhaustion. Liam saw this house as a money pit, an asset, a lottery ticket. He didn't see the half-finished projects, the faint pencil marks on the doorframe measuring our height, the memory of our mother's laughter that still echoed in the halls if you listened closely enough. He could have his lawyer. He could have his legal notices and his partition sales. I had this unfinished bird, this house full of ghosts. And I wasn't going to let them go without a fight. A week passed in a state of suspended animation. The snow outside began to melt under a reluctant sun, revealing muddy patches of lawn and the gray, weary face of a long winter. The house settled around me, its groans and creaks no longer a comfort, but a constant, nagging reminder of its vulnerability, and my own. I spent the days in a grim routine. Work a 12-hour shift at the clinic. Come home to the suffocating silence. Eat something I couldn't taste. And wait. The official letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a mail carrier who had to trudge through the slush to get the registered mail slip to my door. It was thick, heavy, and felt cold to the touch. I signed for it with a hand that felt disconnected from my body and opened it at the kitchen table. The same spot where my life had tilted off its axis. The language inside was a bludgeon. It was full of phrases like, immediate liquidation of shared assets, failure to cooperate, and, court-ordered appraisal. It was designed to make me feel small, to strip the history and love from the house and reduce it to a line item on a legal ledger. It was Liam's voice, filtered through the heartless machinery of the law. I read it once, then folded it neatly and placed it in the folder I'd labeled, Benoit. The fight was no longer just a threat whispered during a snowstorm, it was here. In black and white. That Friday, Aunt Genevieve called. A family potluck. Ma petite, she'd announced, her voice a steamroller of cheerfulness. At my place. Sunday at 5. Just something simple to lift our spirits after this long winter. You must come. And tell your brother. It was a command, not an invitation. Refusing was not an option in our family, it would be a statement. An escalation. And so, on Sunday, I found myself walking up her walkway, carrying a green bean casserole that felt like a prop in a play I hadn't auditioned for. Her house was the complete opposite of mine. Where mine was quiet and full of shadows, hers was bursting with noise and light and the overwhelming scent of about 10 different dishes warming in the oven. Cousins and neighbors I'd known my whole life milled about, their laughter echoing off the floral wallpaper. And in the center of it all was Liam, holding court by the fireplace, a guitar in his lap. He was playing one of Dad's old favorites, a soft, melancholy folk song, and he'd timed his performance perfectly. As I walked in, he was singing the final, heartbreaking verse, his voice full of a carefully crafted sorrow. A few of the older cousins were dabbing their eyes. He was the grieving artist, the sensitive soul. He looked up as I entered, gave me a small, sad smile, and a murmur went through the room. Poor children, so hard for them both. I felt a cold fury rise in my throat. He was performing his grief while actively trying to tear apart the last piece of our parents we had left. Aunt Genevieve swept me into a hug, pressing a glass of too sweet wine into my hand. Elara, I'm so glad you came. See, family is the best medicine. She guided me through the crowd, her hand on my back. The whole evening was a masterclass in strategic denial. Everyone knew about the disagreement, but no one would speak of it directly. Instead, they spoke to me in hushed, sympathetic tones, patting my arm and telling me I looked tired. They spoke to Liam with encouraging smiles, asking about his music, his big city life. They were choosing a side without even realizing a battle was being fought. I felt utterly alone in a room full of people who had known me since birth. The moment it happened was so quiet, I almost missed it. I was in the kitchen, helping Genevieve clear some plates. Liam was in the living room, laughing at some story one of our uncles was telling. You know, Cherie, Genevieve said, scraping potato salad into a container. Her back to me. This whole business with the house, it's a shame. But you mustn't worry your pretty head too much. I just nodded, wanting the conversation to be over. Mr. Benoit is a good man, she continued, her voice casual, a bit old-fashioned, but steady. Still, these things can drag on forever. A quiet settlement is always the best way. No need for a big public fight over something like a, what did he call it? A right of first refusal clause. I froze, the plate heavy in my hand. The sounds of the party in the other room, the laughter, the music, my uncle's booming voice, all faded into a dull, distant roar. Right of first refusal. It was a specific legal term. A faint hope Mr. Benoit had mentioned on our call. A possible clause in the original deed that might give me the option to buy Liam's share before it went to market. I had told no one. It was a long shot. A detail buried in county records that Mr. Benoit was still trying to track down. I certainly had not mentioned it to my aunt. I slowly placed the plate on the counter. My own heartbeat was a loud, frantic drum in my ears. I looked at her, at the sturdy, familiar line of her back, the way her shoulders moved as she worked. This woman who had bandaged my knees as a child, who had held me at my parents' funeral, who had just an hour ago looked at me with what I thought was love. She must have felt my stare. She turned, a bright, questioning smile on her face. What is it, ma petite? You look like you've seen a ghost. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. And in that moment, I saw it, the flicker of something cold and hard behind the mask of grandmotherly warmth. Her mask slipped, and as if on cue, she glanced over my shoulder, into the living room. Her eyes met Liam's for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a look of support, or even of conspiracy. It was a look of shared ownership, of a project moving along as planned. Everything clicked into place with a sickening finality. Her constant defense of Liam's dreams. Her subtle undermining of my position. Her showing up the night Liam gave me the letter. She wasn't a mediator. She was his accomplice. I felt the floor drop out from under me. I have a headache, I stammered, backing away from the counter. The wine. I think I should go. Oh, but dear, you've barely eaten, she protested, her voice dripping with false concern. I'm sorry, I have to go. I fled, grabbing my coat and purse, murmuring excuses to the confused faces I passed. I didn't look at Liam. I couldn't. As I stepped out onto the porch, the frigid night air was a shock, but a welcome one. It was sharp and clean, and it failed to cut through the suffocating sense of betrayal that was choking me. I had walked into that house thinking I was in a fight with my brother. I walked out realizing I was in a war, completely surrounded by enemies who looked just like family. The 10-minute drive home from my aunt's house felt like an eternity. The headlights cut a frantic tunnel through the darkness, illuminating the dirty mountains of snow piled on the roadside by the plows. Each familiar landmark, the old covered bridge, the frozen dairy bar with its smiling cow sign, the turnoff for Miller's Pond, seemed alien, as if I was seeing my hometown for the very first time. Through the eyes of a stranger. Genevieve's words echoed in my head, playing on a loop. A quiet settlement is always best, right of first refusal. Each word, so casually delivered, was a small, sharp piece of glass working its way into my heart. I replayed the last few years in my mind with a sickening new filter. Every time my aunt had taken Liam's side in a family argument, framing his irresponsibility as artistic passion. Every time she'd subtly praised his courage for leaving Claremont, while calling my decision to stay dutiful. It hadn't been mediation. It had been a slow, methodical campaign of psychological warfare, and I had been too blind with grief and love to see it. When I pulled into my driveway, the house was dark and silent, but it no longer felt empty. It felt haunted, not by the gentle ghosts of my parents, but by the living specters of deceit and conspiracy. The betrayal had a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. I had been fighting a two-front war without even knowing it. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling a new kind of anger take root. It was different from the hurt I felt from Liam's actions. This was a cold, sharp-edged rage. I had been played for a fool by the two people I thought I had left. The grief that had softened my edges for 3 years began to recede, replaced by something harder, something crystalline. I got out of bed, a new resolve settling over me. I was done searching for legal loopholes. I was going to search for the truth. My father's workshop was a small, detached building behind the house, a place I hadn't set foot in since he died. The air inside was frigid and smelled of sawdust, turpentine, and cold steel. It was his sanctuary. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. Tools hung in perfect, obsessive order from a pegboard wall. Jars of screws and nails were neatly labeled. Stacks of hardwood, maple, cherry, and oak were piled in a corner, waiting for projects that would never be started. Unlike the attic, which was a chaotic archive of our family's life, the workshop was a testament to one man's quiet, methodical mind. I ran my hand along his workbench, my fingers brushing against a fine layer of sawdust. This was where he came to think, to build, to fix what was broken. I hoped to God he'd left a fix for this. I started with his old metal desk. It was full of invoices for lumber, old equipment manuals, and sketches for furniture. Nothing. I went through tool chests, cabinets, and shelves. For hours, I searched, the only sounds my own breathing and the mournful hoot of an owl in the woods behind the house. I found nothing but the mundane artifacts of a life well lived. Just as I was about to give up, my eyes landed on a small bookshelf in the corner. It held his collection of engineering textbooks and dog-eared woodworking magazines. And on the top shelf, one book stood out. It was a thick, leather-bound copy of Moby Dick. It was the one book he'd ever read for pleasure. He'd told me he'd read it once a year, claiming it was about more than just a whale. It was about obsession, and how a man can be destroyed searching for a truth that should have been left in the deep. I remembered him, sitting in his armchair, holding this exact book, telling me, everything important is in here. Elara. I'd thought he meant the story. I took the book down. It felt heavier than it should. I fanned the pages, and my breath caught. Near the middle, a perfect rectangle had been carved out of the pages, and nestled inside was a thick, sealed envelope of heavy parchment paper. My name wasn't on it. My mother's was. For Isabel. It was written in my father's familiar, blocky script. The back was sealed with a drop of dark red wax, stamped with the signet ring he always wore. It had never been opened. My hands trembled as I carried it back to the house, my boots crunching on the frozen snow under a sky full of cold, indifferent stars. In the warm light of the kitchen, the envelope seemed to glow with a terrible importance. This was it. This was the secret. He had written it for her, but she had died before he could give it to her. With the tip of a kitchen knife, I carefully broke the wax seal. The paper inside was thick and covered in my father's writing. It wasn't a legal document. It was a confession. I sat down, my legs suddenly weak, and read the story of a man I thought I knew. It told of a mistake made 25 years ago. A lonely business trip, a moment of weakness, an affair. It told of a child born from that mistake. A boy. It told of his decision to bring that boy into his family, to raise him as his own. A secret he kept locked away in his heart. A penance he paid every day by trying to be the perfect husband and father. The words on the page swam before my eyes. Liam. My brother was my half-brother. The world tilted, the floor seeming to fall away beneath me. Every memory of our childhood was instantly recast in a harsh, new light. My mother's quiet sadness, my father's over-the-top efforts to treat us equally. The subtle but persistent feeling that Liam was somehow playing by a different set of rules. It all made a sick, terrible kind of sense. And then I read the final paragraph. This house, Isabel, he wrote, it must always be Elara's. It is the only thing of real value that came from your family. From your mother. It must be her anchor, her security. It is the only way I can think of to honor you, to make right a fraction of what I have wronged. He will be provided for, but the house must be hers. It is my final wish. It is my only prayer. A storm of emotions crashed over me. Grief, hot and sharp, for the father I never really knew, for the mother who may have lived her whole life beside a devastating secret. And then came the anger. A pure, righteous fury that burned away the tears. This was it. This was the weapon. This fight was no longer about a foundation or a mortgage or even a home. It was about justice for my mother. It was about honoring the final wish of a flawed, guilty man who had tried, in his own way, to protect what he had broken. I stood up and walked to the window. The letter clutched in my hand. The moon was high now, casting the snow in a brilliant, silver light. I was still alone. I was still surrounded by betrayal. But I was no longer just defending. I was ready to attack. The meeting was set for 10 o'clock on a Friday morning in Mr. Benoit's office. His law practice was on the second floor of a brick building on Claremont's Main Street. Above the pharmacy, the office itself probably hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The air was heavy with the smell of old books and brewing coffee. A faded painting of a winter landscape hung crookedly on the wood-paneled wall. The whole place felt steeped in a kind of slow, deliberate justice that was completely at odds with the frantic, jagged emotions I was carrying. I sat beside Mr. Benoit, my back ramrod straight. In my purse, the letter rested in a protective plastic sleeve, feeling both as heavy as a stone and as fragile as a butterfly's wing. Across the small wooden conference table, Liam sat beside a man who must have been his lawyer. A slick, sharp-suited man in his early 30s named Davies who kept tapping impatiently at a tablet. Liam was trying for an air of detached cool, but his bouncing knee gave away his anxiety. And at the head of the table, having insisted on being there for moral support, was Aunt Genevieve. She'd brought a tin of her butter tarts, which sat unopened in the center of the table like a peace offering in a war zone. She wore a look of pained neutrality, the concerned matriarch caught between two squabbling children. The performance was flawless. Mr. Davies started, his voice smooth and confident. So, we're all here to hopefully expedite this unfortunate process. We have a preliminary market appraisal here, he said, tapping his tablet, which puts the property's value significantly higher than anticipated. My client, Mr. Richard, is prepared to be reasonable. But his position is firm. A sale is the only equitable path forward. Mr. Benoit steepled his fingers, his calm a stark contrast to Davies' aggressive energy. My client, Miss Dubois, maintains that the sentimental and historical value of the property far outweighs its market price. The house is her home, not just an asset. Sentimental value doesn't pay taxes. Mr. Benoit, Davies said with a dismissive little smile. The two lawyers went back and forth, their words a sterile ballet of legal jargon. I watched Liam. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the crooked painting on the wall, his expression a mixture of resentment and impatience. My father would have wanted what's fair. Liam finally cut in, his voice tight. He would have wanted his only son to have a chance at a future. That was it. That was my opening. You're right, Liam, I said, my voice cutting through the room. Clear and steady. Everyone looked at me. Dad did want what's fair. And he was very specific about what that meant. I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope. I placed it gently on the table, on top of the unopened tin of butter tarts. The room fell silent. I could see the confusion on Liam's face, the flicker of professional curiosity on his lawyer's. Genevieve just watched, her hands folded primly in her lap. What is this? Liam asked, his eyes narrowed. It's a letter, I said, from Dad. He wrote it for Mom. But she never got to read it. I think you should. I slid the envelope across the polished wood. It stopped right in front of him. He stared at it, then at me, a flicker of fear in his eyes. With a shaking hand, he opened the flap and pulled out the pages. I watched his face as he read. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving a sickly, gray pallor. The confident facade crumbled, replaced by a raw, slack-jawed shock. His eyes, wide with disbelief, scanned the pages again and again, as if trying to force the words to rearrange themselves into a different truth. The hand holding the letter began to tremble violently. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wild. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking through me, at a past that had been ripped away and revealed as a lie. No, he whispered. The word was a puff of air, devoid of all his usual bravado. No, that's a lie. It's his handwriting. Liam, I said softly. The shock finally gave way. Not to the shame or the surrender I had expected, but to a wave of pure, unadulterated rage. He shot to his feet, knocking his chair over with a loud clatter. The letter crumpled in his clenched fist. A lie, he roared, his voice cracking. He pointed a shaking finger at me. This is a trick. You faked this. Liam, calm down, his lawyer said, standing up, looking flustered for the first time. Calm down? Liam's laugh was a terrible, broken sound. My whole life has been a lie. And you want me to calm down? He turned his fury on the memory of our father. So that's what I was? His dirty little secret? The charity case he took in? All those years, telling me he was proud of me, telling me I was his son, all of it was just a performance to ease his guilty conscience? His pain was a raw, living thing in that small, stuffy room. It was so potent, so real, that for a moment, my own anger was extinguished by a wave of pity. But the moment didn't last. He turned his wild eyes back to me. And the house, he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing snarl. It was supposed to be yours? To honor Mom? To make up for what he did to her? Well, here's a new plan. He leaned across the table, his face inches from mine. You think this letter is your trump card? You think this makes me walk away? No, this makes me fight harder. If I was never really part of this perfect little family, then I don't owe his memory a damn thing. I will take my half of this house and I will burn it to the ground with the money. I'm not just selling it for my future anymore, Elara. Now, I'm selling it out of spite. His words were a physical blow. The weapon I thought would save me had just been turned against me, transformed into a declaration of total war. While the chaos erupted, Liam shouting, Davies trying to restrain him, Mr. Benoit looking on with grim resignation. My eyes found Aunt Genevieve. She hadn't moved. She was still sitting at the head of the table, a spectator to the carnage she had engineered. And on her face, for just a fraction of a second, was the faintest trace of a smile. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It was a smirk of pure, reptilian satisfaction, the kind of look a person has when a plan decades in the making finally comes to fruition. She had won. She hadn't gotten a house or money. She had gotten something she clearly wanted more, the complete and utter ruin of her brother's legacy. Liam finally stormed out of the room, his lawyer scurrying after him, apologizing over his shoulder. The door slammed shut, leaving behind a silence that was louder than the shouting. I was left sitting at the table, the tin of butter tarts still unopened, a symbol of a peace that had never been possible. The letter, my secret weapon, lay crumpled on the floor. I had walked into this office feeling righteous and powerful, holding what I believed was the undeniable truth. I walked out carrying a despair so heavy I could barely breathe. The truth hadn't set me free. It had just shown me the true depth of my prison. The weeks that followed were a gray, muddy blur, just like the world outside as the snow finally surrendered to the grudging arrival of spring. The fight was over. I had lost. The reality of it was a constant, dull ache behind my ribs. My life became a series of small surrenders. I met with a real estate agent who walked through the house with a practiced, sympathetic smile, talking about good bones and curb appeal, while my parents' ghosts screamed silently in every corner. Appraisers came, their measuring tapes and clipboards reducing a lifetime of memories to square footage and market comparisons. I started to pack. I moved through the rooms in a daze, wrapping my mother's china in newspaper, taking my father's books down from the shelves. Each object was a fresh stab of grief. This was my penance, I thought, for unearthing a secret that should have stayed buried. My truth had not been a shield. It had been a torch that had burned the last of our family bridges to the ground. Liam didn't speak to me, and I didn't see Genevieve. There was nothing left to say. The final meeting was scheduled at Mr. Benoit's office. The signing, the official end. I walked up the creaking stairs, feeling a sense of dread so profound it was almost peaceful. The worst had already happened. This was just the paperwork. They were already there, sitting in the same chairs as before. Liam looked different. He was confident, almost arrogant, dressed in a new jacket. The desperate, cornered animal from our last meeting was gone, replaced by the victor. Aunt Genevieve sat beside him, a serene, contented look on her face. She was knitting. The quiet click-clack of her needles was the only sound in the room as we waited for Mr. Benoit. She didn't look at me. Mr. Benoit finally entered, carrying a thin file. His face was grim, his shoulders slumped. He looked as defeated as I felt. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and cleared his throat. "We are here today to finalize the court-ordered sale of the property at 14 Cedar Lane," he began, his voice a monotone. Mr. Davies, Liam's lawyer, slid a thick document to the center of the table. "The final agreement. If you'll both just sign on the indicated pages," Davies said, tapping the document with a manicured finger. Liam reached for the pen, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. This was it, the finish line. "Wait," Mr. Benoit said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room with an authority that made everyone freeze. He looked at Davies. "There is another document that requires our attention." Davies frowned. "All disclosures have been made. There are no other documents." "There is now," Mr. Benoit said. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a long, cream-colored envelope. It was old, the edges softened with age. He placed it on the table. "The legal action your client initiated," he said, nodding towards Liam. "The formal filing of the dispute triggered a specific protocol at your parents' bank. A clause in their safety deposit box agreement. It stated that in the event of a legal dispute between the heirs, the lawyer for the executor, myself, would be granted sole access to the contents. I retrieved this yesterday." My heart started a slow, heavy pounding. Liam stared at the envelope, his confidence wavering. Genevieve's knitting needles had stopped their rhythmic clicking. "This letter," Mr. Benoit continued, his voice resonating with a new gravity, "is from your mother, Isabelle Dubois." He opened the unsealed envelope and took out a single sheet of paper, covered in my mother's elegant, sloping handwriting. A ghost had just entered the room. Mr. Benoit began to read. "To be opened only in the event of a legal conflict between my children regarding the disposition of my family home." He paused, looking over his glasses at Liam, then at me. "My dearest Elara and Liam," he read, "if you are hearing these words, it means my greatest fear has come to pass. You have allowed pain and money to stand between you. Before any further action is taken, there is a truth you must both understand." The room was utterly still. Even the traffic outside seemed to have stopped. "I have always known about your father's infidelity, Liam. I have known from the beginning that you were his son, but not mine by blood. It is a pain I chose to carry silently, because my love for the family we built was stronger than the hurt of that betrayal. I loved you, my sweet boy, from the moment your father brought you home, and I have never, for one second, considered you anything less than my own son." Liam made a small, strangled sound. His face, which had been so full of triumph, was now a mask of utter disbelief. Genevieve stared at the letter, her face ashen. Mr. Benoit continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I knew your father carried a great guilt. I also knew he might try to amend this guilt by favoring Elara in his will, particularly concerning the house, which was my own inheritance from my parents. I could not allow that. It would only sow bitterness between you. Therefore," he read, his voice gaining strength, "I used the remainder of my own personal inheritance to establish an independent, confidential trust, the Isabelle Dubois Legacy Trust." He looked up from the page. "The trust's sole purpose was to be a gift to you, Liam. Upon the sale of the house, the trust would be dissolved, with the full principal, approximately $150,000, transferred to you, to pay off your debts and fund the beginnings of your music career." Liam's jaw had dropped. He stared at the letter, speechless, as tears began to well in his eyes. He was being offered the salvation he'd been fighting for, a gift from the mother he thought he was betraying. "However," Mr. Benoit said, and the word landed with the force of a physical blow. He read the final paragraph from the letter. "This trust comes with one single, unbreakable condition. It is to be executed only upon the sale of the house if, and only if, that sale is agreed upon amicably by both of my children, as equal partners. The legal filing must be mutual, an act of cooperation. If the sale is initiated by a hostile, unilateral legal action from one sibling against the other, the trust is rendered null and void." with the entire principal to be donated to the Claremont Community Music Program for underprivileged children. A profound, shattering silence filled the room. It was the sound of a life's meaning changing in an instant. It was the sound of a ghost passing judgment. Liam stared at the useless legal papers in front of him. The ones he had filed. The hostile, unilateral action that had just cost him everything. He had done it. His rage, his spite, his greed. He had single-handedly destroyed the one gift of pure, unconditional love that could have saved him. A terrible, animal sound of grief tore from his throat. He slumped forward in his chair, his head in his hands, his body shaking with racking, silent sobs. I looked at Genevieve. Her face was a statue of shock. Her smug victory turned to dust. Her decades-long campaign of whispered poisons and subtle manipulations, all meant to dishonor my mother's memory, had culminated in this, the revelation of Isabel's final, stunning act of grace. My mother had won. Her love had been the last word. Her forgiveness the final, devastating move in a game Genevieve hadn't even known she was playing. Mr. Benoit quietly picked up the thick legal agreement that Liam and his lawyer had brought. He didn't tear it, he simply rolled it up, stood, and walked over to the tall office shredder. He fed the document into the slot, and the machine whirred to life, its grinding teeth the only sound in the room, devouring my brother's victory, page by page. The battle was over, but as I looked at my broken brother and my defeated aunt, there was no triumph, no satisfaction. There was only the immense, heartbreaking weight of my mother's love, a love so powerful it had reached out from the grave to have the final say. We never spoke again after that day in Mr. Benoit's office. There was nothing left to say. The truth had scoured us clean of all pretenses, leaving only the raw, ugly truth of what we had become to each other. Liam left Claremont within the week. He didn't say goodbye. I heard from a cousin that he took his legally mandated half of the house's value, a significant sum, but one that would be quickly devoured by his lawyer's fees and the mountain of debt he'd accumulated. He forfeited the true prize, the incredible gift my mother had tried to give him, and I imagine the weight of that knowledge would be a heavier burden than any debt. He got the money he fought for, but he lost his history. I wasn't sure he knew the difference. Aunt Genevieve seemed to shrink. The next time I saw her, at the local IGA, she was pushing a cart down the frozen foods aisle, looking smaller, older. Her reign as the family's bustling, all-knowing matriarch was over. The web of whispers and manipulations she had woven for years had unraveled, leaving her exposed and isolated in its ruins. We made eye contact for a brief, excruciating moment. There was no apology in her eyes. There was nothing at all. We were strangers now, connected only by a shared, poisoned history. In the end, I sold the house. The decision was the hardest and easiest I've ever made. After the final meeting, I walked through its silent rooms, my mother's letter in my hand. The house was no longer a sanctuary of memories. It was a monument to secrets, to pain. The crack in the foundation was more than just physical. My mother, in her infinite wisdom, had known the truth. You cannot build a future on a broken foundation. To stay would be to live forever in the shadow of their tragic, complicated love. To truly honor her, I had to let it go. I sold it on my own terms, to a young family from the city with 2 small children, whose laughter I could already imagine echoing in the halls. I watched them and hoped the house would give them what it had given me for so many years, deep roots, and a place to feel safe. Now, I live in a small, bright apartment on the top floor of a new building overlooking the river. It's clean and modern, with white walls and big windows that let in the light. It has no history, no ghosts in the walls, no attic full of memories. It is a blank page, and it is entirely mine. The spring has come in full force now. The last of the dirty snow has melted. The river has thawed, and the air carries the sweet, damp scent of new beginnings. From my balcony, I can see the buds on the maple trees turning from red to a vibrant, hopeful green. I don't have much from the old house. I only kept the things that mattered. My father's unfinished wooden bird sits on my windowsill, a reminder that some things are beautiful precisely because they are incomplete. A single photograph of my parents on their wedding day is on my nightstand, I can finally look at it and see not their secrets, but their flawed, fierce, and enduring love. And I have my mother's letter. I keep it in a small wooden box. And sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I take it out and read it. Her words are no longer a shock or a weapon. They are a compass. They remind me of her strength, of a grace so profound it could hold both a deep betrayal and an even deeper love in the very same heart. Tonight, a warm breeze drifts through the open balcony door. I am alone, but for the first time in years, I am not lonely. Liam got his money. Genevieve got her revenge. My father, I hope, found his peace. But my mother, she left me the greatest inheritance of all. She left me this quiet strength, this freedom. She taught me that a home isn't just a place of wood and nails you inherit. It's a foundation of truth and forgiveness you have to be strong enough to build for yourself. At its heart, this story asks a question many of us face in our own lives. What is a home really worth? For Elara, the battle for her parents' house wasn't about the market value or the property lines. It was about fighting for the last remnants of a past she cherished. But as she fought, she discovered that the foundation of her family was fractured by secrets she never could have imagined. Her journey reminds us that so often, the conflicts we have with our loved ones aren't about the present argument, they're about the ghosts of the past, old wounds, unspoken resentments, and the quiet pain that gets passed down through generations. The greatest lesson here isn't about winning the fight. It's about finding the quiet strength to understand the truth, even when it shatters the beautiful illusions we've built our lives upon. True freedom and true strength often come from letting go of the very thing we were fighting to protect. It's about realizing that you can't build a healthy future on a broken foundation. Sometimes, you have to be brave enough to walk away from the ruins of what was, and start building a life whose foundation is entirely, truly your own. Every family has its own unspoken history, its own ghosts in the walls. If a piece of this story resonated with you, we'd be honored if you shared your own experience or thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for sharing this time with us. May you find peace in your own story, and the strength to build your own foundation.